One of the best-known names in the treatment of dementia patients sits at the center of a bigger debate about pharmaceutical companies, physicians, and how doctors choose the prescriptions they provide. First, the news of the day is that Johnson & Johnson has just agreed to a $2.2 billion settlement with the government, in large part over the way it marketed the antipsychotic drug Risperdal for use by dementia patients. From 2002 to 2003, that was an off-label use of the drug, not approved at that time by the FDA. It has since been approved for use in dementia treatment and by young patients as well. And it has been an enormously successful product. Bloomberg reports that Risperdal had worldwide sales of $24.2 billion from 2003 to 2010. But it was that off-label period that raised alarm. The federal government insisted that Johnson & Johnson's marketing effort, including compensation to doctors, amounted to reckless endangerment of patients young and old.
The payment of kickbacks undermines the independent medical judgment of healthcare providers. It creates financial incentives to increase the use of certain drugs, potentially putting the health of some patients at risk. The companies allegedly downplayed the serious health risks that were associated with Risperdal, including the risk of stroke in elderly patients, and even paid doctors to induce them to prescribe these drugs. Put simply, the alleged conduct is shameful, and it is unacceptable. It displayed a reckless indifference to the safety of the American people, and it constituted a clear abuse of the public trust, showing a blatant disregard for systems and laws designed to protect public health.
Joining us here in the studio is Patrick Burns, co-director of Taxpayers Against Fraud Education Fund. Mr. Burns, let's talk a little bit about this case. I mean, it actually originated with an individual, a whistleblower, as it were, who brought this to the government's attention. But as it turned out, didn't quite get the government's attention, at least right away. Why was it a problem, and what does this tell us?
Well, whistleblowers come to the government with examples of fraud, and the government often doesn't quite understand the fraud. Fraud's a little like a magic act. If it was that obvious, everybody would see it, no one would profit. So the government looks at it, they don't quite understand it, and then they start lawyering it. What happened in this particular case was the whistleblower realized that essentially what was going on here was payola was being paid, and this was poisoning for profit. And he was very, very upset about it. He went ultimately to the New York Times. He lost his job. Then he went to Texas. And in Texas, it went before a jury. The jury started to read all of the emails inside the company. And before that case went to jury for consideration, the company settled for a very large sum of money.
And in the end, this whistleblower was compensated for coming forward.
Yeah, he was. After he had spent the winter without heat, after he had been terrified, after he had lost his job. The truth of the matter is when whistleblowers go into this, and when their lawyers go into this, they have no idea whether they're going to actually be successful or not. And the bottom line is that they pay a huge price, as the patients do, if they're not.
Let's go back to this specific case, though. In this particular case, this is your organization is a taxpayer organization, and I wonder how you can relate these two things. I mean, isn't this really a stockholder issue rather than a taxpayer issue? The stockholders of Johnson & Johnson, shouldn't they be the ones who are upset rather than the American taxpayer?
Well, both. Remember, if the fraud is not caught, the people who foot the bill are the taxpayer. If the fraud is caught, then the people who foot the bill for the fine are the Johnson & Johnson stockholders. And that's part of the problem. The problem is either way the fraud goes, nameless, faceless people outside of the building have to pay the cost of it. The people inside Johnson & Johnson, the people who designed, who operationalized, and who greenlit the fraud, they got promoted.
But in this particular case, I mean, in the settlement papers, and there are a lot of them, but in no point does it actually identify any particular individual who is responsible for this. This is a penalty that Johnson & Johnson overall will pay $2.2 billion in settlement money, but not a particular individual was named as being complicit or responsible.
Well, sure. What happens is the government settles. It's sort of, remember that settling for somebody isn't necessarily a strong endorsement of a good deal. The government didn't take this to trial. The Johnson & Johnson didn't take it to trial. The bottom line is that this case was, this fraud wasn't a mystery. It was designed and operationalized within Johnson & Johnson. They were paying kickbacks. That means they were paying cash, payola. They had a whole system to off-label market this drug. They've been warned by the FDA. They were paying the chief pharmacist of the state of Pennsylvania, the chief pharmacist of the state of Texas, in order to get them to approve this drug for off-label and illegal purposes. This was a cash and carry. This was a pay-to-say gambit, and it was organized and operationalized within Janssen and the
parent company.
The parent company. And the people who did that were promoted all the way up the top.
Now going forward, I'm looking at this, it is not just Johnson & Johnson, but there are a number of other pharmaceutical companies that off-label marketed and suggested the use of their antipsychotic drugs, maybe under different names, but other antipsychotic medications. Going forward, what happens, are there greater concerns?
There are greater concerns. First of all, there's patient harm here, there's patient risk here. The basic gambit of the pharmaceutical industry is they don't really have anything too new to sell. So in this particular case, you had Risperdal, which was competing with two other drugs, Seroquel and Zyprexa. The gambit in the pharmaceutical trade, in which there's essentially a commodity, the same drug will do the same thing. You either try to grow the pie, which is off-label marketing, or you try to get a bigger slice of the pie by paying kickbacks to doctors. Or, in the case of Johnson & Johnson, you do both.
We want to bring on board Patrick Burns. Thank you very much from the Taxpayers Against Fraud Education Fund. We want to bring on board here Dr. Gregory Smith. He's a former anesthesiologist and president of the Comprehensive Pain Relief Group. Doctor, appreciate your being with us, and want to point out that you have produced a documentary because you have some concerns. Your documentary is American Addict, and it raises the question about how pharmaceutical companies market to doctors. And if we could, I'd just like to take a few seconds to look at some of your documentary.
Pharmaceutical representatives are universally attractive. They get recruited from places like cheerleading squads at Big Ten schools.
What I'm holding is a bottle of Zyprexa. Zyprexa is an antipsychotic medication. It's very popular and it's very expensive. This, among some of the others, Abilify, are very, very commonly diverted. The reason being is, again, the medical programs, insurance programs pay a lot of money for these drugs.
What was once a diagnostic manual that was paper thin is now a huge book with hundreds of diagnoses in it.
To the point where people are being sliced and diced.
And it's the lawyer's fault, okay? It's the lawyer's fault. We invented corporations. We didn't give it a conscience. We didn't give it a soul. You can't put it in jail.
Doctor, that is a really interesting little segment of your American Addict documentary, but it really goes to this business of how pharmaceutical companies reach out and market to doctors, and going beyond this idea that you would use fashion models in effect to lure doctors into using medications. That might be surprising to a lot of patients.
Right. Well, let me first say that when we started making this documentary, I was trying to answer the simple question or the fact that we're approximately 5% of the world's population, but we utilize 80% of the world's hydrocodone, which is in medications like Vicodin and Norco, and 50% of the world's prescription drugs in general. So it's like, how is this possible? This is definitely not a coincidence. We're like one of only two civilized countries that right now allow direct marketing to patients on television and other media. So there's no surprise that we have become a society that's a pill for a problem. You go to a physician at this point in time, most of the time, if you can't sleep, you get a pill. If you feel a little sad, you get a pill. If you have anxiety, you get a pill. We're not treating the underlying cause, and this is why there is so much abuse of pharmaceuticals right now.
Okay, but let's go to this particular case, and it really arises out of the off-label use, which maybe patients don't understand, but essentially what's happening here is the FDA says, okay, you can use this medication for this purpose. That would be the labeled use. But some of these companies have marketed them to physicians and said, look, this has been effective in other areas. Is that about right?
Yeah, I mean, off-labeling's been done for a long period of time, and I don't think that it's always necessarily a bad thing. When it's abused, it's a bad thing, and often it is abused. These fines are nothing new. Today was I think the largest one ever, but it's still not big enough to prevent these big pharmaceutical companies from doing this fraud. Because when you look at it, $2.2 billion sounds like a lot of money to the average person, and it is. But as you showed earlier in your promo, they made over $24 billion just for one of the 3 drugs that they got in trouble for today. So off-labeling is extremely common, but it's not always a bad thing. But in this case, or in the case where they're pushing the drug to make money, it is a very bad thing.
And on that point, I mean, you are, in your practice, you have used some pharmaceuticals off-label, as it were?
Absolutely. In chronic pain, I do chronic pain and addiction medicine, and very often in chronic pain, because it's not the same as regular acute pain where narcotics aren't as effective all the time, we use different medications off-label a lot. As I do with nutritional supplements and things of that nature. But that's very different than what's going on here. We have big pharmaceutical companies perpetuating the use simply to, as was stated by your other guest, to expand the marketplace of a medication that's already FDA approved for a different reason. It's a big, big problem.
As a physician, do you feel that you were ever approached in a way that really seemed like a hard sell on a pharmaceutical company's part?
Well, you know, it's evolved over the years. I mean, I got out of medical school over 20 years ago, and there were days where people actually just got money or gifts to do things. Now it's a lot different. You know, you get lunches and pins and things like that, but most of the time the reps are trained very hard not to talk about off-label uses. But the trick is they'll get other physicians at meetings and in other forums, internet forums, to sort of talk loosely about the medications and other ways it can be done, but the reps themselves don't necessarily do it.
Dr. Smith, we appreciate your being with us and helping patients to understand a little bit what's going on in the background. Dr. Gregory A. Smith, his film is The American Addict. Coming up here, a rift in the ranks.